My loves, I am so happy and so pleased to announce that this episode is brought to you by my very own company, Savage Chocolates, which is all about cultivating a more loving relationship to your body and to food. You know, we don't really believe in guilty pleasure. We just believe in pleasure done well. Right? Have you ever had that candy bar or thing of ice cream and you eat it and you're like, wait, I don't remember eating that. Wait, where'd that go? Well, that's why I created Savage Chocolates, because I know the importance of pleasure. And I think that we don't slow down enough to actually experience it. And so if you are wanting to eat mindfully, if you are wanting to be reminded of how to actually experience your pleasure, then please go to www.savagelosangeles.com to order your goods. All right, you guys, let's get to it. Mark, thank you so much for being on the show. I'm really grateful to see you.
Thank you for having me.
Oh my goodness. So I was just telling you a little bit about kind of what we're all about here at Savage Lifecast, but I would love for you to tell us all a little bit about who you are, what you do, and why you do it.
Sure. Well, my background is pretty traditional. I went to Princeton. I was one of the captains of the tennis team there, went into investment banking like many of my classmates, left New York and joined a Silicon Valley strategy firm where I spent 10 years, became a partner. So that's my background. Most of what we're going to talk about has nothing to do with that.
You're right.
In 2016, while I was still at my firm, I was listening to podcasts. And at the time, there were a bunch of things in my life that were not going so great. As someone who was so achievement focused, I had some business deals that didn't go my way for reasons out of my control. Some personal stuff wasn't going my way. And in the back of my mind, I thought life was meaningless, because that's what science taught me, is that we randomly exist.
Yeah.
There's no meaning to life. We can make up meaning, but that's just our own rationalization.
Right.
And that's where I was. And when things in my life weren't going great and I was on this treadmill and realized, wait, there's no end to this, I was pretty lost. At the time, I wasn't actively looking for something different, but it happens now in hindsight that when I look back on it, I was listening to podcasts on business and health and came across one episode on a health podcast that talked about psychic abilities.
Cool.
And consciousness beyond the body and things like that. And it was enough for me to say, that's pretty interesting. Let me listen to more podcasts like this when I'm driving from San Francisco into Silicon Valley in traffic for most of the day. So I'll just listen to some of these interesting podcasts. It didn't change my life initially, but the more I listened to podcasts like it and heard individual accounts and then started to read some of the science behind this, my life shifted dramatically. I became very disoriented and said, wait a second, I've got to rethink everything. Because whatever I thought life was before, something much bigger is going on.
Yeah.
And that, in short, is what led me to where I am now. I ended up researching for a year, just nonstop, because I wanted to learn more, and then ended up writing a book, and then to Upside Down Thinking, which we can talk about. Then I produced a podcast in 2019 where I interviewed many of the scientists on these topics, and then left my firm at the end of 2019. In 2020, wrote a second book, and ended Upside Down Living. And I have been not in my job, but with no plans. I've been meditating hours a day and researching. So that's in a nutshell where I am.
That was a fantastic arc. I'm all about it. Awesome. Well, so cool. I love, I talk about it all the time on this podcast, but I think it is so real that, and I think it was Mark Groves who actually said it originally, that we take a mess and we turn it into a message. And it's really, in so many ways what you did. You're like, life is meaningless. I'm going to find the meaning. And now I'm sharing it with other people. Yeah. And that's when I truly believe we find a purpose, right? Through these messes. So you talk a lot about consciousness. And I think for people who, and of course, I love everything that you're talking about, psychic abilities, ESP, I've read a lot in it. I've also done a lot of exploration with psychedelics and all sorts of fun things. But for our audience, can you just talk to us a little bit about what consciousness is / what it isn't?
Great question. Well, I'll start my answer by saying that language is insufficient to explain what it is.
Totally.
That's one of the big challenges. So I'll use language, or whatever I use as an approximation. And the way I like to think about consciousness is that it is our sense of experiencing life. It's the awareness that we all have right now that is experiencing this conversation, hearing it, listening to it, processing it. And the challenge with consciousness is that it's not physical. Whereas my leg, I can touch my leg, I can touch this table. But if you ask me to touch consciousness or touch my mind, my mental space, it's not physical.
Right.
And this is really the centerpiece of probably everything I will ever do, because this gets into what is the nature of reality. And it comes down to this simple issue of the brain, which typically in our society today, we say, oh, the reason that we have mental abilities and the reason that we can think and have awareness is because our brains are so complex. There's chemical activity, there's electrical activity up here in my skull, and that is why I'm able to have awareness. Mm. What I was shocked to learn is that science has no idea how that could happen if it does. And Science Magazine, which is a very credible outlet, has said it's the number 2 question that remains in all of science. And I'm paraphrasing. How is it something physical like a brain, which is made out of matter? How could it produce this consciousness things that's so abstract? And of course, what I would argue now is that the brain is not making consciousness, that the reason we are aware is well beyond our body, and the body is actually limiting what we're perceiving. And the brain could be likened to, I like to call it a filter or like a blindfold. Some would say it's like an antenna. The idea is that the brain is interfacing with something beyond our body to get information, almost like a cell phone tapping into the cloud. Mm. So I'm using lots of analogies because if this is new to any of your listeners, it's a complete life changer. Because then it's like, wait a second, what am I? If my sense of identity is my consciousness and my consciousness isn't coming from my body, whoa, what's going on?
Yeah, like who the hell am I and why am I here?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a serious fall, but a beautiful one. Yeah, that's really, really beautiful. Speaking of why are we here, why do you think we're here?
Well, my sense, going back to consciousness before I give an answer to give your audience context.
Yeah.
I love to use an analogy by a philosopher named Dr. Bernardo Kastrup. He said it's like we're whirlpools within an infinite stream of water, where the water's like consciousness. So we have this sense of being an individual, but we're within the broader stream, we're interconnected. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's my overall cosmology in terms of how I think about life, and there's a lot of science to back this up. But the idea that we are one consciousness experiencing individuality. And what I think the meaning of life is probably something beyond what we can comprehend, because our body and our brain limits our ability to understand, like the concept of infinity. We don't understand it, but we kind of know it's real. I think it's similar with thinking about meaning, but there are hints that we have. And one of I'll give you 2 pieces of scientific evidence that point to meaning. And I'm glad you asked the question, because this has really been the centerpiece of my whole journey, is getting to this question. Yeah. One is the idea of reincarnation. Okay, so there's research done at the University of Virginia, over 2,500 cases of children, young children, usually between the age of 2 and 5, who have memories of a previous life. And sometimes, in some cases, the researchers can find the person that the child was referring to in historical records. Sometimes the children have birthmarks and deformities that align with medical records from a previous life. So really credible stuff. And I've interviewed these scientists. I mean, it's unbelievable. But it suggests that if we're whirlpools within the stream of consciousness, that the water can be recycled in a sense. So something from one whirlpool becomes another whirlpool. So that idea of a continuation of consciousness, that's one piece of meaning. Mm. And then I look at the near-death experience phenomenon, where a person has, let's say, cardiac arrest. They go into the state where their brain is barely functional or it's completely off, and they come back in their body after they're resuscitated, and they had this incredible lucid memory. Some people would say, well, that's just a hallucination. The brain releases chemicals and it's like a
DMT,
psychedelic.
The whole thing.
DMT.
Yeah.
The problem is, in some cases, the brain is so far gone that it shouldn't be capable of producing these experiences. But the real kicker is when sometimes people hover over their bodies, they claim, and they describe what happened in the room while they were out. Then they come back, and what they describe is accurate. So the doctors and the family members, sometimes actually not even in the same room, they say, yeah, you're completely right. So if it were a hallucination, they wouldn't get an accurate memory. So it's not a hallucination sometimes. all that's to say that what happens in this near-death experience state, it's almost like our brain is a filter. It blocks us from this reality. It blocks us from the broader stream of consciousness. And when you take the blindfold off, like in a near-death experience, get the brain out of the way, the broader reality, it becomes evident. So what does this broader reality perhaps teach us? And now getting to your question about meaning. People talk about the life review phenomenon. They relive their whole lives in the state when their body's off, they're dead, clinically dead, or close to it. And they relive the events in their life, sometimes through the eyes of the people that they impacted. So one of the people that I interviewed for my podcast named Daniel Brinkley, he's well known because he's had 4 near-death experiences over the course of his life.
Whoa. I have not heard of this human. 4 NDEs is so serious.
Struck by lightning once, open heart surgery twice, and brain surgery another time.
Whoa.
And each time he had a life review, he relived his life through the eyes of the people that he impacted, and including his time in Vietnam when he killed people in combat. And he told me he was vicious in combat. So he had to relive the deaths of the people that he killed through their eyes and the pain of the child that would no longer have a father because he had killed the father. So he felt the indirect effects. When he came back into his body, like many people who have these experiences, his life was changed. He became a hospice volunteer. And what he says, like many others, is that the way we treat people is what actually matters in the broader scheme of this grand consciousness. It's not how big your house is. It's like, how did you treat the cashier at the grocery store? So if we have reincarnation process with a sort of a self-judgment, maybe judgment's a strong word, but self-observation to see how we do in life, and the reincarnation might be a mechanism for us to try again while we have an amnesia, we don't actually remember all the stuff.
Right.
That's a long way of saying that life seems to be about the evolution of our consciousness, that we're trying to grow towards a state of joy and love rather than malice.
Yes. And to do it in an embodied state, because if we're all, this consciousness, this sense of oneness that can go or come into a body, to actually have it in an embodied state is different than to be in the collective consciousness of just oneness, and so to actually experience, oh, this is coffee. Oh, this is something physical that I can have a reactivity to, or have this conversation versus just the collective oneness of just pure consciousness and love.
An important point, because on the spiritual path, and I talk about this more in my second book, and End Upside Down Living, is like, well, once we understand we're part of this grand consciousness, what does it mean? Do we just stay in that state of unity? Because sometimes in meditation, people talk about these similar experiences of being blissed out. And that seems to be the nature of the highest level of consciousness, is that it is an infinitely loving state. And even in meditation, I've had in the last year, I've been meditating so much, some experiences where it's like kind of a glimpse of what people have reported. And whatever it is, it was beyond any pleasure in the world that I've ever experienced. But what you're saying, this embodiment point is really critical, because there can be a tendency to just get lost in trying to get that sensation, but we're in a body. So it's like, the terms that I like to use are the one big consciousness, which is our identity at some level. Some call it the one mind, to quote the Nobel Prize winning physicist Erwin Schrödinger. He said, in truth, there's only one mind. So one mind, but we're experiencing the individual as a diverse part of the one mind. The one mind level of reality is true, even though we're not perceiving it right now. Some will call that the absolute level. There's also a relative level, that there's a Mark and Alexa here, apparently seeming separate and in a body, and I have a bottle of water here and someone else coffee, and we're experiencing the world. The paradox is that they're both happening simultaneously. So it's like trying to be that oneness while in the body, and that's the challenge, because it's part of the human experience, and it's a complete paradox.
So wild. So wild. Thank you for that. And everything you're describing is so, in my experiences, and that's all I know in this time and space is my own experience of things like watching my mother leave her body and her experience of that. It's everything that you are describing. It was before she left her body. It was all visuals of, there was no time. Right. So it was all oneness. She was seeing people that had already passed. She was having conversations with people who were already gone. And it was not hallucinogenic. It was pure presence, but her mind was shifting. And it's just beautiful to have an experience of that myself, not even as a person with an NDE, but just to have bared witness to it is really, really amazing.
There's a name for that phenomenon because research scientists have looked at this. It's called the deathbed vision.
Wow.
And it is a known phenomenon. Like the University of Virginia, among other places, have looked at it, where something about nearing the time of death, like the veil goes away.
Yes.
I don't understand it fully. There's a related phenomenon known as terminal lucidity. And it's like when a person's nearing death, let's say someone's had Alzheimer's disease and they've been out of it for a long time. Suddenly, right, like maybe shortly before they're going to die, they snap back into clarity as if nothing were wrong.
Yes.
So somehow their brain is damaged and yet they have this period of lucidity. And it's like, I don't know, maybe the dimensions open up. There's also, you're reminding me of a phenomenon known as a shared death experience. It may be similar to what you had, I don't know exactly, but where a bystander at the bedside lives the near-death experience with the person who's dying, sometimes co-living the life review. So it's like they both enter the dimension.
Yes.
That one's pretty wild. But these things are reported, and
yes,
it's super important for us to just acknowledge there's more than meets the eye.
Oh, without a doubt. My mother's experience, so I did not have a shared death experience with her, although we did a lot of, my mother she passed about 5 months ago, and
sorry.
And thank you so much. But we had a long time to prepare. She had stage 4 cancer. She was given 6 months. She lived 6 years. And so, we did so much reading and so much exploration, everything from workshops with, this, that, and the other person to, of course, psychedelics and all the things. But she told me about her shared death experience that she had with her father. And when her father passed, she and him left their body and went up into the corner of the room and looked down and could see the whole scene. Like it was like she could see her sitting by her father's hospital bed and she could see her father's body. And they were hovering in the corner, and then he continued to leave and she went back into her body.
Wow.
But it was just one of those things where you're like, okay, this is not uncommon. Like my mother had this, it's pretty phenomenal. And to think that this information is out there, and yet we're so living in the confines of our body and thinking that this is finite, that we are finite and the body is finite. But like what you're talking about is just so important. I'm so grateful that you're doing this work.
Well, we are conditioned not to think about this. It's not taught in our education system. It's dismissed often as woo-woo, pseudoscience. And one of the things I talk about in my podcast, and especially my first book, is some of the dynamics in science where this information is actively suppressed. Wow. And I'm actually on the board of the Institute of Noetic Sciences, which is it was founded in 1973 by an Apollo 14 astronaut who had a mystical experience coming back from the moon. That's what he describes. And he founded this institute outside of academia to be able to study like telepathy, mind-to-mind communication, or distant healing. Incredible scientists. But these are people that had to leave academia because you can't get tenure. You could lose your job if you try to study many of these topics. So I think it's important for the evolution of our education system really to start teaching people about the possibility of all this stuff, because it would change people's lives, I think, in a positive way. I know for me it has, and people around me. It's hard to live if you really don't think there's meaning, and that's what science is teaching, whether they say it explicitly or not. They talk about this, just we're the speck in a big universe and we're meaningless. That's like the general tenor of the conversation.
So talking about telepathy and other forms of communication and like just being able to see the future and all of those things, is this a skill that you think many of us are able to harness, or is this kind of like only for select individuals, or how do you feel about that?
My sense is that it's innate, so every single person has it, but there's a spectrum of abilities. So we're like a basketball player. Everyone can dribble a ball, but not everyone is Michael Jordan or LeBron James on the court. I think that's how it works. So I'll give you an example from one of the most credible scientific studies. It's known as the Gansfeld experiment. And to simplify how it works, you have one person in a room, let's say his name is Bob, and he's just sitting in a relaxed state. He's put into a meditative state because some people believe when your brain is quieter, maybe you have more access. But he's in this meditative state. And there's a woman named Jane who's in another room. They don't Bob doesn't know what Jane is looking at in the room, but the experimenters are showing her an image of something, and she's asked to try to mentally send it to Bob in the other room, even though she doesn't claim to have psychic ability. So she's like sitting there mentally saying, well, I'm looking at this image, I'm sending it to Bob. They're separate for a while. Then Bob is shown 4 pictures, one of which is the one Jane was trying to send. He doesn't know which one it was. And if there were no effect at all, you would expect that over decades of research, thousands of trials, the person in Bob's room would guess correctly 1 out of 4 times, because it should just be a random event. It should just be 25%. But the person in Bob's room guesses correctly closer to 32% of the time, which using statistics is massively significant. It's known as a 6 sigma result, meaning that the odds that this is happening due to chance alone is more than 1 billion to 1. Wow. And in scientific terms, okay, that's a real effect. Something's going on. Some information is getting through. It's like some of the water from Jane's whirlpool is getting into Bob's, like a little bit of it. And there might be ways to harness those abilities into practice. And I talked to Russell Targ, who ran or was one of the leaders of the US government psychic spying program, which began in the 1970s. And he's run courses and taught many of the remote viewers how to do this. So I think maybe we have innate abilities that can be on a scale just like any other skill. But even if someone is at a quote unquote low level, there are ways to enhance those abilities.
Wow. What are some of those ways?
I think ultimately it's about quieting the mind. That's what the remote viewing teaches. So remote viewing is the ability to perceive something that's far away, both in space and time. Okay. And the teachers who I've talked to, they'll say, well, just go into a quiet state, and they're trying to picture what they'll call a target. They don't know what the target is. It might be like a picture of a lion. It might be a building. But they're told to just sit there quietly and describe or draw whatever images pop into their mind without judgment, and just see what happens. And wow. I think the more the research shows, the more that people think or are trying to actively make it happen, the less the performance is.
Yes, like trying to use your mind to figure it out. You're like, I'm going to muscle my way rather than like actually receiving any information.
Yes.
Wow.
Exactly. It's a receptive, passive state. That's how it's described. Wow.
And it's so beautiful that you were just giving the image of like water from a whirlpool, like the yin and yang. Yin is water element. It is receptive in nature. And so that's really powerful. Wow. Cool. So I know you've been spending a lot of time meditating. Do you have a specific meditation practice that you have harnessed, or is it just kind of up for grabs? And have you been able to kind of turn the volume up on your abilities?
The intent behind my meditation, at least so far, has not really been about psychic abilities, even though maybe I feel like I'm more intuitive in general than I was before.
Sure. It's
more about trying to connect to this, whatever it is, intelligence that's beyond us, the broader stream of consciousness. And for me, it's become so energetic. The story behind this is that I couldn't meditate for 15 minutes. Even my journey started in 2016, went on this path. I went on meditation retreats, 2 silent retreats before the pandemic hit in 2020. One was 6 days, one was 5 days, no talking, just like
Vipassana.
It wasn't quite Vipassana. They were 2 teachers. One was Adyashanti and her name's Mukti. So It was sort of like non-denominational spiritual teachers, but silent for those periods. And for someone who couldn't sit still, like that was a big challenge in the beginning.
No doubt.
But I had a breakthrough, I think, in terms of just being able to do it, because the energy started to flow in. I started to feel pulsations in my forehead, which I now know is the third eye.
Yes.
Different, like, I don't even know how to explain it, because it's energetic, like flowing through my body, different parts of my body. Like a lot of times, even right now, because I meditated a bunch this morning, there's this like pressure in my head. And I feel the energy moving through different parts of my face. And like, this was not happening to me before, but now it's very real. When I meditate now, going back to your question, I'm just kind of sitting in that space, almost letting the energy discharge, and whatever comes in, I let come in. Sometimes my mind becomes overactive. That's okay sometimes, because I do a lot of research and I'm like almost congealing what I learn and consolidating it. Other times it's too much, and I'll just sit and focus on my breathing, and then you go back into a state of stillness. And that's Adyashanti's method. I really like his teachings. It's almost like a method of just being and trying to be still, both in the body and the mind, as much as possible. And for me, when that happens now, the energy is incredibly strong. So I have a way now of calibrating my meditation because I feel the energy to different degrees.
Wow. That's so, so powerful. Everybody get involved with the meditation, and Adyashanti is amazing. And I don't know Mukti, but sounds phenomenal.
His wife.
Very cool.
They're very similar in their philosophy.
That's so powerful. Okay, cool. So we have meditation. Do you, or have you accessed any other tools that you find that help us get to this state of just remembering? I feel like it's a remembering more than anything. It's getting back in touch.
I like the way the yogic tradition categorizes the areas, because I think it applies to any tradition of basically spiritual development. One is jnana yoga, which is the pathway of knowledge and wisdom. And for me, that's kind of been my primary path of connection through trying to understand the nature of reality. What is all this? Why am I here? Is there meaning, like you asked? And trying to really hone in on that and understand the world in which we live in the context of this broader consciousness. So that's one, knowledge and wisdom. Another is karma yoga, which broadly is selfless service, thinking about how we're going to be of service. There's the devotional path, which is the bhakti yoga. And that's could be like an attitude of understanding divine love and that we're part of this whole thing. Some would do it through prayer or chanting, but that's just a kind of a devotional quality. And the fourth category is energy, which could be meditation, yoga, anything that focuses on the body, really, and our energetic connection. So it's a broad category. Knowledge, wisdom, selfless service, devotion, and energy. Those are the pathways, really, that encompass anything you could try. And they're like different pathways up the mountain. And ultimately, they are interconnected. So you end up doing all of them once you get really far in one. Like for me, it was all knowledge in the beginning, all just learning, and then started to have some weird synchronicities. Like, whoa, that's kind of weird. And then was meditating a little bit, and things start to spiral. And then it's like, well, I should share this with people because it's very impactful. And that's a form of service.
Karma. Yeah, totally. Oh, that's so good. That's so good. So I have a few questions. I'm like, which one should I go first? All of this talk around consciousness and around potentially reincarnation and, all of these things makes me want to bring up like organized religion and how, and I don't know if you have any thoughts or insights on this, but just, I was not raised under any sort of denomination in particular, and I very much am in alignment with everything that you're saying. So I say this from a place of just kind of curiosity around organized religion and some of the belief systems that are very heavy in our culture around why we are here. And I feel like everything you're talking about seems to be so expansive versus certain organized religions seems to be very kind of restrictive. And I just would love to know your insights on that.
I think I'm inherently rebellious toward the idea of organized religion. I grew up in a Jewish household. We weren't very religious, but I always questioned it because like, why am I just going to follow these rules? It didn't make sense to me. Now I've looked a little bit at various religions, and there is a central theme, if you get behind the rituals and some of the more dogmatic ideas, that aligns with the idea that we're part of a unified consciousness and that we're here for some evolutionary purpose. They might put it in different ways, but that's a core principle, a core spiritual principle of probably every, most, if not all, religions. Then the question becomes, what kinds of beliefs are tacked onto that as the only way, or do I have to practice X, Y, and Z in order to find the true meaning? That's where I start to struggle with pathways or religions that say there's only one way and it's just this. I start to become hesitant. So I would say mixed feelings about the nature of religion, depending on the religion, depending on the person that's speaking about it, because I do think there's a lot of truth in some of the core teachings. And it's possible, looking at religious stories, that there might be truth to what they're describing in terms of history, about the history of humankind, that maybe there were supernatural things happening. And I say supernatural in quotes because maybe we just don't have the science yet to understand it. And that can be an interesting way of looking at it. So I would say overall, there's a lot to be learned from religion, but I become cautious when it starts to seem dogmatic and there isn't an openness. That gives me caution.
Totally. And I concur. I think it's one of those things where it's like, okay, well, it's kind of been manipulated. Like I look at, and to anyone listening who is Christian or Catholic, bless your heart, bless you. But I look at the teachings of Christ, like Christ consciousness is really like, I think the teaching of Christ, but then we add on top of it kind of the, I don't know, it feels like compression to me. And maybe that's the dogma, and I just think that's fascinating.
Well, anytime things are institutionalized, there's a risk of manipulation.
Yeah.
And we see that like in all parts of society. So I don't think any religion or any group is immune from that. And it's important because we're thinking about the nature of reality, and we always have to be mindful of how it could be polluted by different motives. To me, what I found to be most useful is looking at direct experiences of people. Because even most of the religions, like in Judaism, it's Moses, and Christianity, it's Jesus, Muhammad and Islam.
Yeah.
They're looking at the experience of someone who probably did have a mystical experience or had some transcendent experience. And we have lots of those to report on today. And we have technology to be able to document it and to spread the information, whether it's near-death experiences or meditation experiences or psychedelics or just regular spiritually transformative experiences that happen in everyday life. There are commonalities across those, which happen to align with a lot of the religious traditions. And that's just been my way of approaching it, of like, well, how, we put it all together. What are the common threads? In like the Venn diagram, what's the middle?
So good. So you're talking about mystical experiences. Would you be able to share? I know that you have a podcast, which I'd love to put in the show notes as well. So of course, everyone, please head on to Mark's show. But I would love for you to share either a mystical experience of yours or maybe of one of your guests on your podcast, just to give people an idea of what the heck that means.
Sure. Well, my podcast is called Where's My Mind? And I interviewed a number of people who've had near-death experiences, and they talk about this feeling of being immersed in unconditional love and things like that. So I haven't had that experience like what they describe. I haven't had an experience where I felt like I've been in another dimension or anything like that. But 2 times in meditation within the last, almost 2 years. One of these was actually before I got really into meditation. I had a similar experience where this energy came in that was trying to use words. And this is one of the common challenges that people talk about. They can't really describe it, language. It's like trying to explain the taste of chocolate to someone that's never had a dessert before. How do you even do it? So I'm going to give analogies. The energy that came in was very light, almost like my body was dense and the lightness was coming in. It was not like a being. I didn't feel like there was a third party, but my body was becoming light and it was entering my body and it was extremely pleasurable. That's the best way to describe it. Like I said earlier, it was beyond any pleasure that I could describe.
Right.
And I remember thinking, now I understand why someone would go meditate in a cave for 10 years, because if we're all trying to experience good things, this is better than anything I've had. So
totally.
That's the way I would explain it. It was sort of like a love sensation. There was a parallel to that, but it was not like a personal love. It was something way bigger than that. So that experience happened. The first time it happened, it was so overwhelming to my body that I had to actually shut it down, or I don't know if I did intentionally or whatever it was. It was terrifying. Yeah. Because there was a sense of dying, and in many spiritual traditions, they talk about ego death.
I was just going to say it. Yes.
It was probably something like that. And it was too much for me to handle at the time. Fast forward maybe 6 months later, it was at the end of my first meditation retreat was Mukti was the first one. I came back home, I was meditating, and I had a similar experience where the energy came in. It was a love-esque experience, feeling completely overwhelming. But the second time I had a strange phenomenon while my eyes were closed that I was spinning like in circles somehow. But I wasn't, I opened my eyes and I wasn't moving. And there was a sense that I was going to disappear. That's what, in a split second, I was experiencing, like, I'm going to disappear. Wait, Mark, you can't let this happen, because there would be people that would be very upset if you just disappeared. Like, that's what, whatever my mind was thinking at the time, and it shut it down again. So I don't know if that's good or bad. When I think in hindsight, I happened to write my second book in the following few days. So maybe I needed to shut it down. I don't know.
Yeah.
Whatever it was extremely mystical. And no one can tell me it didn't happen, because it did happen.
Of course.
And I'm still having remnants of that energy all the time now.
Yes.
So I think, like, for me, having done all this research and looked at experiences of other people, then to have the experiences happen to me personally, even if it was just a tiny glimpse, that brings reality to it. And I say that because we live our lives and there's so many distractions that we get caught up in, but we're living in this reality that seems to be much bigger than what our eyes show us.
Yes.
And to not pay attention to that could be a mistake or could be misleading. And this gets to how I think about life now, and really the question of my second book, which is, what is the overall intention of your life? That's how I start the book. How do we direct the compass of our life? Is it based on just what we see in the world, or are we part of some bigger consciousness? Is reincarnation real? Is there a broader meaning? Because if there is, then the way we prioritize everything in our life will change. And that's what happened for me. I was working in the business world, and I couldn't rationalize spending so much mental energy on those areas because I wasn't as interested, and I had this bigger perspective. So I got to the point where it was very challenging, because I'd spent 10 years at the firm, very close with everyone. To tell my business partners that I needed to do something else, that was a hard thing to do, but my compass really shifted. That's what happened.
Wow. When people feel that call, like when people feel like, okay, I'm on the precipice, I want to make a shift, I feel like my compass needs to shift, obviously, of course, like what you're talking about with meditation, getting quiet, and these yogic paths. Would you recommend, I don't know, would you recommend any books, or would you recommend, of course, yours, but things that helped you along your path? And of course, we'll put your books in the show notes. I want everyone to get their hands on that too. But other teachers and other teachings that you would recommend for people who are curious.
Definitely. Well, part of the reason I'm doing what I'm doing is to try to create a primer, because my books and my podcast, they put a lot of sources together, and it's sort of like, okay, well, if you're more interested in this, you can read these books or look up this person. I would say, in terms of the scientific, I'll talk about the scientific realm and the spiritual realm, even though they're connected. But for me, the science has been impactful because that's my background. So looking at the work of like Dr. Bruce Grayson, for example, he's a researcher at the University of Virginia. He has a new book out called After, which talks about his decades looking at the near-death experience. I actually haven't read it yet, but I interviewed him. He's really smart. So Dr. Bruce Grayson and other people in his space, like Dr. Raymond Moody, it's very powerful to learn about what people have observed in these cases, because they go back throughout history too. It's just that now our resuscitation technology is so much better that we have more and more cases of bringing people back. These are people that are directly experiencing what they would call this unified benevolent force. It's very powerful to learn about that. So that the near-death experience is a big one, but also the psychic abilities, and looking at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, Dr. Dean Radin, R-A-D-I-N, he's done a lot of research on the statistics of all this stuff. So those are a few resources in that area. In the spiritual realm, it becomes tricky, because the more I looked at this, I realized that there's a spectrum of quote unquote teachers. And even within teachers, you could have someone that was really at a high level, but then maybe became corrupted or became less pure. It's known as the fallen guru syndrome. And the three areas where people go astray, and this is Mariana Kaplan has studied many of these gurus. She talks about money, sex, and power. Those are the three ways that a guru or any individual can be seduced by something that takes them off their path.
Yes.
And I say that because if we're interested in these topics, we can get distracted with stuff that's not going to be most beneficial. So it's like, how do we find the highest teachers that are not polluted in any way, so we can be most efficient? Probably many of the religious teachings have hints of this in them. For me, so there have been a few. Dr. David Hawkins, he's famous for his scale of consciousness. He wrote Power versus Force, which is a very famous book. I've actually been less drawn to the scale of consciousness part, but more to his teachings, because they were, I think, very pure, and he was somewhat contemporary. He died, I think, in 2012 or 2013, and he was a psychiatrist before he had his big awakening. So he does a lot on deconstructing the ego, which is really important, because we are this ego, even though there's the much broader stuff. And He has a book called Letting Go, The Pathway of Surrender, which is the last one he wrote before he passed away. And I've had a number of friends who have read that who are pretty mainstream people. And this book bridges the gap pretty well. Letting Go, The Pathway of Surrender. It's like one of those books that it's worth reading more than once. And if one really absorbs what he's saying and puts it into practice, like the notion of surrender while not being passive, there's so much to it. But it's like a life changer in terms of how to think about life.
God, that's so good. Those are such good resources. I'm really excited about this, and I'm really excited to get my hands on your books as well. I just looked at the clock. I'm like, it's already been 40 minutes. I feel like I want to just say, thank you so much for this wealth of wisdom that you just dropped on us. This is so beautiful. And then B, just ask, where can we connect to you? Like, where are you the most active? Social media, website, where can we find you?
My website is my name, markgober.com, markgober.com. And it has summary information on my books and podcasts and everything else, whatever ends up coming up next, which I don't know what that will be. Also, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Mark Gober author. I post things occasionally, but if I have any announcements, I have a mailing list on my website as well.
Great. Mark, thank you for this. You are so awesome. I cannot wait to share this and just spread the good word. It's good stuff.
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for all that you're doing. I think podcasts like this are extremely important. For me, it was the podcast that shifted my compass. It was like the initial step. So I always think about that because I've done so many of these conversations in the last few years.
Yes.
And you never know who's going to hear it, and you never know when. It could be 10 years from now that someone hears this conversation and it sparks something. And
yes,
you reminded me of something that Daniel Brinkley said. He's the man who had 4 near-death experiences. I was listening a few months ago to a lecture he gave. It was on YouTube. I don't know, maybe 10 years ago. And he was saying something like, I'm giving this talk right now very selfishly because I know it's going to change some of your lives, and I'm going to get to experience that in my life review because I'm going to get to see the positive impact this has.
Oh, that's so good. That's so good. And, I ESP a little bit going on because today I was having kind of an ego moment because I was posting something that I found to be very meaningful on social media, and the post just was kind of getting swallowed by the algorithm. And I had this moment of like, fuck, like, I just really want people to like know what I'm talking about because I think it's important. And then I had this thought, I was like, maybe after I die, people will see it. Like whenever that is. And so it's just that moment of like, when it gets known, it's not up to me. And in my life review, I hope that this will have touched people.
Yeah. Well, Alexa, I think about that all the time because I'm like, wow, this stuff is so life-changing. If people understood it, it could make their lives so great. Completely. But it's not up to me for someone to have those realizations. Like the best we can do is just put it out there and make it accessible. The people will do it on their own time.
Totally.
And I don't know when that is for each person.
It's like power versus force, like I can't force it. Like just let it be in its power and it will attract what it needs to attract when it's ready to attract it. So
that's it.
That's it.
Render whatever attachments we have to outcomes and just say, I'm going to do my best. And I can't control the outcome. So I'm going to let it be.
Letting go, the power of surrender.
Yeah.
Awesome. Mark, you rock. I really appreciate you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
All right, you guys, thank you so much for carving out the time to listen to this wisdom, to listen to all this goodness. Once again, gentle reminder to please check out savagelosangeles.com to learn more about my new company that I'm so proud of. I hope it inspires you to create and cultivate a life that you dig. And also, if you are down and have, 10 seconds, then please give this podcast a 5-star review on iTunes. Super easy. Just give it 5 stars, maybe say a few kind words. And if you dug it, please share it with your friends. I would be over the moon with gratitude. All right. You guys are the bee's knees. Much love. Stay savage.